All right. Hello again, everybody. Hope we're all doing well. The semester is probably moving pretty fast at this point. Today we're going to be covering relatively difficult concepts, right? So you've seen some so far. You should have seen some pretty complex arguments about God's existence and cosmological and ontological arguments for God's existence. Today, we're going to be looking at some equally difficult arguments. It's okay if you don't understand at the outset, um, but get in touch with me if you need assistance. Um, but today, focus on the concepts and focus on the moves. Right? I'm not going to ask you to reconstruct this argument, but you do need to know to reconstruct it. So you need to know what it says and know some of the basics. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the problem of evil. This is a set of arguments and responses and problems uh, in the philosophy of religion that deal with the presence of evil in God's existence. So how can a theist, right? How can somebody that believes in God make sense of evil, right, on the one hand, and make sense of God's existence on the other? Because God is supposed to be perfectly good, perfectly loving, perfectly powerful. So he should have the character that would say that evil shouldn't exist, right? And he should be powerful enough to destroy evil, yet evil still exists in the world. So, how can we reconcile these two claims, right? Um, the problem of evil is going to be an objection to God's existence on behalf of an atheist, right? So, so an atheist is going to say, look, given evil and given what you think God is, it seems like God does not exist, right? Or it's likely that God not exist given the presence of evil. So in this, let's see, in this lecture, we're going to be um, doing several things, many things actually. So we're going to look at the problem of evil as I've already indicated, a cluster of arguments, problems, and questions and responses about evil and God's existence. So we're going to be examining what's called the narrow problem of evil. This is arguments from evil against God's existence. We're going to look at two. We're going to look at the logical problem of evil and what's called the evidential argument from evil. We're going to distinguish these two like species of arguments, right? And then we're going to look at some examples of those kinds of arguments. We're going to respond to what's called the Epicurean argument or Epicurean logical argument from evil. Um, it's Epicurean because it comes from Epicurus, ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosopher, who gives a version of this kind of argument from evil a long time ago, right? So we're going to examine that. We're going to respond to it, and then we're going to go over some terminology. So we'll talk about what's called the existential problem of evil, and then responses from theists. So defenses and theodicies. We're going to distinguish those broadly. So we got a lot chalked up on the agenda today, but we're just going to take it one bite at a time. So an argument is logical, right? If and only if, right? So necessary and sufficient condition. It has a premise that God's existence is logically incompatible with the existence of evil, right? So God and evil are logically incompatible. So, what do we mean by logically incompatible? By logically incompatible, we mean that these two things are mutually exclusive. That is, they can't both be true at the same time, right? One of them has to be false. Either there is evil and there's no God, or there is God or a God and no evil. So the logical arguments from evil are going to say that these two claims cannot both be true, right? They are irreconcilable, mutually exclusive. Okay, so here is the an example of a logical argument from evil. So recall that the logical and evidential arguments are both species of arguments, right? So we could give any number of different kinds of logical arguments from evil and any number of different kinds of evidential arguments from evil. So here is one specific kind of logical argument from evil. Okay, so premise one. If God exists, then there is a being that is both omnipotent and perfectly good, right? So we have talked already about some of the divine attributes. Two of these divine attributes are that God is all powerful and all good, right? So God can't do evil. What God wills happens, right? Because of God's power, right? Um, so if God exists, then there is something that is omnipotent and perfectly good. Okay, an omnipotent being could prevent the existence of any evil God wished to prevent, right? So the idea here is that an omnipotent being is so powerful that that being can prevent any evils, right? Um, God can prevent me from, say, stubbing my toe. God could prevent any number of international large scale evils that we can imagine, right? God can prevent a lion from eating, say, a zebra, right? So all of these different kinds of evils, um, God can prevent those evils because God is all powerful. Okay. Premise three, a perfectly good being prevents or eliminates the existence of any evil it can. The idea here is that God's character should be that of concern for us, right? So a perfectly good being will always prevent evils. Okay, so God, given that God is perfectly good, God would prevent me from stubbing my toe. God would prevent the lion from eating the zebra. God would prevent any large scale international evil or suffering that we could imagine, right? So, given these two characteristics about God, um, if there is a being that is both omnipotent and perfectly good, that is God, then evil does not exist. God can prevent the evils, and God would prevent the evils. Okay, so if God exists, there will be no evils. Okay, premise five says that evil actually does in fact exist, right? There's evil all over the place. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Uh, uh, at least at the making of this video, we're in the middle of a pandemic. So God could prevent all of this evil, all of this suffering, and God would prevent all of this suffering. Yet the proponent of this argument says that evil does exist, which is likely the most plausible premise of this argument. Okay, so premise six says that therefore it is not the case that a being exists that is both omnipotent and perfectly good, because we said that evil does exist, and if God were to exist according to premise four, right? If God exists, then evil doesn't exist. Yet evil does exist. So it follows that a being that is both omnipotent and perfectly good does not exist. Therefore, the conclusion of the argument is God does not exist, right? So, where God is defined as a being that is omnipotent and perfectly good, given the presence of evil, God does not exist, right? So, a theist could respond to this in one way that's problematic. Um, uh, a theist could say, well, God's just not omnipotent, or God's not perfectly good. right? So many theists want to maintain that God is supremely powerful and also perfectly good. And so that is a response that, even though that could respond to this argument, right? Um, that's not a bullet that many theists are willing to bite, right? So it seems like we have a tough argument against the existence of God here, and this is an example of a logical problem of evil because there's a premise, right, that evil does exist, and given the fact that evil exists, it can't be the case that God also exists, right? So these two claims, evil and God, are mutually exclusive. Okay. So this is a deductive logical argument from evil, right? So here, if there is a God, then there are no pointless evils. Um, a pointless evil is an evil that a perfectly good and all-powerful being could have prevented and could not possibly have a morally sufficient reason for not preventing, right? So here we're talking about a morally sufficient reason. We can talk about whether or not God has a morally sufficient reason for allowing an evil to occur, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. But the idea is that a pointless evil is an evil where no good could possibly come from, right? Say I stub my toe. Um, say I stub my toe, and I'd say, goodness gracious, what good could ever come from me stubbing my toe? And if I don't see any good reason for me stubbing my toe, I might wonder, well, God, why would you let me stub my toe um, if it wasn't for any good reason, right? So the idea with a pointless evil is that God couldn't possibly have any reason for allowing that evil to occur. So premise two is there are pointless evils, right? So there are evils that God couldn't have any reason to let happen, right? Um, and if it's the case that there are pointless evils, well, then there's no God, right? So this is another logical or another form or example of a logical argument from evil. Okay, so this is the evidential argument from evil. So an argument from evil that God does not exist is evidential if and only if it is not a logical argument from evil. Because either, one, there is no premise that uh, God and the presence of evil are mutually exclusive, right? So, kind of like we said with the logical argument from evil, there's a logical incompatibility between God's existence and evil. An evidentialist argument from evil is not going to have that as a premise, right? Or even though there's a premise that states that some evil is logically incompatible with the existence of God, the premise in question is not decisive. That means that that's not the reason that we are rejecting God's existence, right? So, broadly speaking, an evidentialist argument from evil is going to say, look, there are evils. Evils count as evidence against God's existence, right? So, um, so suppose that I'm agnostic, right? And I'm trying to figure out, well, does God exist or does God not exist? I'm deliberating about these two claims. Um, I'm going to be seeking out evidence for thinking that God does exist or evidence for thinking that God doesn't exist. Evil counts, according to the proponent of an evidential argument, counts as counts as evidence against God's existence. Um, so it's not that given the presence of evil there is no God. Rather, um, the existence of evil marks against God's existence, and it favors atheism, right? So if I'm going to just follow the evidence, then that the given evil, I'm just going to come to the conclusion that God does not exist. Okay, so here's an example of um, an evidentialist argument from evil that argues for an epistemic claim. Okay, so an epistemic claim is, and we're going to be talking about epistemology later in the semester, right? So, um, epistemic basically just means knowledge related or belief related, right? So, here the conclusion of this argument is that we should not believe that God exists, right? So the conclusion is a claim about us rather than a claim about God, right? So it's not, we shouldn't believe that God exists because the evidence does not favor God's existence. Rather, we should believe that God does not exist, or we should just withhold belief, right? So it's this specific evidentialist argument has a conclusion about what's rational about us. So premise one: if the probability of a theory T on evidence E is low, and we possess E, and there is no evidence E1 that substantially raises the probability of T, then we should not believe T, right? So if we are given a theory, the idea here is that if we're given a theory and the evidence that we have that supports that theory is relatively low, and we lack other evidence that supports T, we should just not believe T, right? Okay, so premise two says that if the probability that God exists is low, given the existence of horrendous evils in the world, right? Uh, there are horrendous evils, and there is no evidence that raises the probability that God does exist, then we should not believe that God exists. Okay, so there are horrendous evils in the world, right? So there are evils, and horrendous evils here are just evils that we are uncomfortable imagining, right? So it's not like me stubbing my toe. That's a kind of evil, right? But rather, horrendous evils are things like the loss of life of children, say, things that are so overwhelmingly awful that they warrant certain kinds of responses in us. So, given that there are such evils in the world, evils that prima facie or at first glance suggest the life of the participant of that evil can't be a good or meaningful life, right? Or suggest that God is not perfectly good. So there are evils, right, that that affect us in this kind of way, right? So four wants to claim that um, given that there are horrendous evils, the probability that God exists is really, really low, right? Um, so five says that there is no evidence that substantially raises the probability that God exists or of theism. So we should not believe that God exists, right? So we have evidence that marks against God's existence. We don't have any other evidence that suggests that God exists. So that means that to be rational, we should not believe that God exists, right? So this is, like I said, one example of an evidential argument from evil. Okay, now we're going to return to the Epicurean problem of evil. And we're going to give a response to it. So, first, recall that we examined this argument, and the idea here is that um, if God exists, then there's something that is omnipotent and perfectly good. An omnipotent being can prevent any evil that that being wishes to. A perfectly good being would prevent any evil, right? But there are evils in the world, right? And so it follows from that that there is no perfectly good omnipotent being, right? Okay, that's the gist of this argument. So we're going to be looking at premise three uh, in um, quite a bit of detail, right? We're going to question whether or not premise three is true. Okay. So, um, so first we need to distinguish between the presence of, or between moral evils and natural evils. The idea here is that a moral evil is an evil that is done by an agent, right? So if I kick you in the shin, or I rob you, or stab you, say, all of these are done from my volition, right? These are things done to you in a way that is morally problematic, in a way that's evil, right? So there's an agent that's causing certain evils. Now, uh, these are not the same as natural evils. A natural evil is an evil that occurs in nature, or just by chance, right? So suppose that my car runs out of gas on the train tracks and I get hit by a train, right? This just a thing that happened. Nobody willed that to happen to me, right? So a natural evil is an evil that is not willed, whereas a moral evil is an evil that is willed. Okay, so we can consider premise three of the Epicurean logical problem of evil. So, according to premise three, a perfectly good being can or will eliminate any evil it can, right? Okay, so let's apply this premise to a specific case. Um, if a mother is a perfectly good mother, then that mother eliminates any evil she can, right? So, um, the idea here is that mothers love their children, right? If I am a mother, or if I'm a father, say, I'm going to keep my son or daughter from suffering, right? um, I'm obviously going to protect my children, right? Um, so it seems like if I'm going to be a perfectly good mother or father, a perfectly good parent, then I have to eliminate any evil that my child could experience, right? Um, Now, is that true, right? Should we think that way about this premise? Like, is premise three star true? Um, Here are two reasons for thinking no, right? So first is consider it's at the time of recording this video, it's November 1st. So yesterday was Halloween, right? So suppose that I were to take my child and we went trick or treating, right? We get all this candy, and suppose I know that the if my kid eats too much candy, well, she's going to get sick, right? And so I say, look, you have to stop eating candy. I'm not going to let you eat any more candy. And so she might have a fit. She might say, what are you saying, Dad? Don't do this, blah, 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 right, right, this and that and the other. Um, uh, I am causing the child to suffer, right? This is an evil that I could prevent. I could say, keep giving her candy, or let her keep eating candy at the risk of, say, developing intemperance, right? Or at the risk of her getting sick, right? But instead, I prevent her from eating more candy, which causes her to suffer, which does her an evil. But I have a reason that outweighs the suffering that she's experiencing by not eating candy, right? This is, well, we already talked about this, but this is a morally sufficient reason. So if I have a morally sufficient reason for allowing some suffering to occur, I can still be a perfectly good parent, right? I can still be a perfectly good being, right? Um, Consider also an analogous case, right? So suppose that my child has cancer and doesn't know or recognize the dangers of cancer. um, she might ask me, well, why? suppose I take her to chemotherapy, and she suffers greatly in chemotherapy. She might ask me, well, why are you letting these doctors do all of this stuff to me? It hurts me. And I could prevent that suffering, but I don't, because I know that there's a greater good involved, right? I have a reason for allowing her to undergo the chemotherapy, even though she doesn't understand. And that reason is presumably morally sufficient, right? It outweighs the reason that I have for not letting her go to the chemotherapy, right? So there's a reason why I'm allowing her to suffer at that point in time. Okay, so the idea here is that um, given that premise 3 star, right? That's a perfectly good mother. Then that mother eliminates any evil she can. Given that that's likely false in light of the cases, the Halloween case and the chemotherapy case that we looked at, we have to modify premise 3, right? So we have to modify it with premise 3 star. A perfectly good being eliminates any evil it can, unless, with a caveat, unless it has a morally sufficient reason not to. For example, e.g. means for example, it wants to eliminate some greater evil or bring about a good that outweighs the evil it permits, right? So we need to have, so if there is, the idea here is that if God is perfectly good, then God will prevent any evil that God can, unless God has a morally sufficient reason to, unless God is like the mother from the cases that we looked at before, right? So we're going to rebuild this argument with the modified premise, right? So we add that a perfectly good being prevents or eliminates the existence of any evil it can, unless it has a morally sufficient reason not to, right? In the case of chemotherapy. So this, if we modify premise 3, then that we have to also modify premises 4 and premises 5, right? So let's do that. So we have the argument here, and we have to modify premise 4. If an omnipotent and perfectly good being exists, and for any evil E that exists, then for any evil E is such that a perfectly good and omnipotent being has a morally sufficient reason for not preventing E. Okay? So the idea here is that if there are any evils, right, then God has a morally sufficient reason for allowing those evils, right? Um, uh, right. So given what we've said, given how we've modified 3, 4 follows from 3. If there are any evils, those evils are such that God has a reason for allowing them to occur. Now, premise 5, it is not the case that for any evil E is such that a perfectly good and omnipotent being has a morally sufficient reason for not preventing, right? So this is this premise says that, look, God doesn't have a morally sufficient reason for every single evil that occurs in the world, right? How could God have a morally sufficient reason for all of these different things in the world? So it follows that it is not the case that there's a being that is both omnipotent and perfectly good, and so God doesn't exist. However, the response here, so I'm going to claim that this reconstruction of the Epicurean logical argument from evil is um, is um, is invalid, right? Meaning that it has a false premise. So I think that premise 5 is false. How, given our standpoint and given God's standpoint, right? How could it be the case that we could claim that God has no reason for allowing some evil, right? So it's kind of like we are children and God's our parent, and our parents know a whole lot more than we do, right? And we think that our parents have no reasons for what they do, right? But really, there is a reason. We just don't understand it, or we just can't see it. Similarly, we might say that there are, say, no reasons that God has for allowing evils, but how could we ever know that, right? So it seems like premise 5 is false. Okay, and so if premise 5 is false, then this argument does not work. Okay, now we're going to talk about um, briefly about the existential problem of evil. So we have been talking about evil and God in the abstract, right? The existential problem of evil is what we think about when we think about Job, right? So Job always asks these questions like, well, what God, why are you allowing all of this evil to happen to me, right? So the existential problem of evil deals with our own personal suffering, right? How could I trust or love a God that causes me to suffer so much, right? Um, these are um, these are deeply personal issues, and you may have encountered the existential problem of evil, and you may have encountered different solutions to this, right? So the purpose of pointing this out is to say that when we talk about the abstract evidential and logical problems of evil, right? We're just thinking about the existence of God and the existence of evil in a way that's impersonal, right? But we can also reflect back on our own suffering and our own experience and wonder whether or not God exists given our own personal suffering, right? So, and it's not a claim about whether or not God exists, but it's how could I particularly trust God, love God, believe in God, or whatever, right? So, the last thing that we're going to be looking at are defenses and theodicies, right? So, various theistic um, um, various theists, right, will respond to the problem of evil with either defenses or theodicies, right? So the essential difference is that between these two terms is that um, a defense points out that it's possible that God exists and evil exists, right? Maybe it may be true here, right? But we're just pointing out, look, I mean, it can be true somewhere, right? Um, It's just saying, hey, look, we can have an account that God exists and evil exists. So if we're responding to the logical problem of evil, we might say, look, it's possible that evil exists and it's possible that God exists. It may or may not be true here in the actual world, right? So recall possible worlds. So it may or may not be true here in here in the actual world, but it is true in some possible world that there is evil and there is um, the existence of God. Whereas a theodicy says that um, is a response to the problem of evil that says that, look, God and evil are compatible, right? These things can both be true, where the actual world is the world in question, right? So it's not just possible that God and evil are reconcilable. Rather, it's that they actually are reconcilable in the actual world, right? We live in a world where it's true that there's evil and it's true that there's God, right? So the distinction between defense and theodicy is just to say that a defense is it's possible that there's God and evil, and the other one says no, it's true, right? It's true here and now that there's evil and there's God. So um, this is the end of the lecture. Email me if you're confused about things, reread the Peterson text, and I'll see you again either tomorrow or today. So, bye bye.